If you take a look at these two cubes, they both contain concrete material. They might look very similar, but the main difference between them is that the left one is made by using PBR materials, and the right one was procedurally generated with nodes in the shader editor. Both methods are very popular in 3D graphics, but they are also suited for different applications and purposes because the way they operate is very different, as they have their pros and cons. So I will go through them, explain the differences, what they are suitable for, and how to use them. Let's start with the pros of PBR materials. The first one is obviously realistic behavior. PBR materials are designed to bring not only realistic visuals but also to accurately simulate their properties, such as roughness, specular reflections, metalness, emission, elevation, and more. With all these properties, they also accurately behave in different lighting conditions, which is definitely a plus. For that reason, PBR materials are often used in architectural visualization, such as interior and exterior design and environment renders, but also in games and movies where CGI needs to meet the requirements of realism for a better user experience. PBR materials are often seamless, which means they don't have visible seams or hard transitions once they're tiled. If you use Blender, you can use nodes such as color ramp to control the individual properties of a material or set the keyframe to the properties to make animation. Another advantage of using PBR materials is platform compatibility. Because PBR materials are very efficient, this shading technique gained global popularity not only among individual 3D artists, but also in different 3D industries. For its efficiency, almost all industry standard programs were optimized to be compatible with this technique, such as Maya, Blender, Unreal Engine, 3ds Max, Unity Cinema 4D, and more. This cross-platform compatibility is important for those who want to use similar shading methods and techniques, but with different 3D programs. So it does not matter what software you use, you can achieve similar results by using the same shading technique. The next advantage is accessibility. There are countless add-ons and online libraries that offer PBR materials for both personal and commercial use, and the best part is that a lot of them are completely free. This means you don't have to create your own, but rather use third-party resources. Now, if you don't know about any of these websites or add-ons, don't worry, because I made a video about a list of completely free online libraries where you can find more than 11,000 materials that are high quality, and they are only waiting for you to download them and use them in your render. Just click on the chart that appears right now. The last advantage I want to mention is that PBR materials are very easy to use, and it doesn't matter if you are a beginner or an advanced 3D artist. Each material is made out of image textures, which contain data about specific properties, and each one of them is connected to specific shader input. The setup process in Blender can be simplified even more if you enable Node Wrangler, which allows you to import any material in just a few seconds. The only thing you need to understand is what each map is doing and where you should connect them. I made a video about this as well, so if you have never heard about PBR materials before or don't really understand them, I recommend checking out my video, where I explain everything you need to know about them. And these are the benefits of PBR materials. And while this shading technique is very powerful, there are some limitations and disadvantages that you should know about. The first is that PBR materials provide only limited variations, because they come as images, so we don't have much control over texture variety unless the material itself comes in more variations. If you are creating your own PBR materials by using tools such as a Substance Designer or Substance Painter, you can create basically unlimited variations of that material and then maybe blend them together, but you also need to recreate all the maps to accurately simulate the physical properties. Another disadvantage is that PBR materials have a huge impact on performance, which significantly slows down the rendering process. This of course depends on what resolution the texture has, the bitrate and the file size. It's important to know that with every resolution doubling, the file size doubles as well, which means Blender needs to work with a lot of additional data, which also means the performance will most likely go down. When you use these materials, the render engine needs to compute data from all maps that simulate their properties, such as how different areas reflect light, how the light will be bent based on the surface, how the geometry will be displaced, what amount of light will be absorbed, and other data, which contributes to longer render time. So if you want to use PBR materials in your render, you don't only need a decent GPU, but also a lot of RAM memory and strong CPU. Now, if you are doing just single image renders, this should not be a big concern for you, but it might be for animators, because if you want to, for example, render a short animation of an interior space with high resolution PBR materials, then during the render, the computer might be completely unusable for other tasks, because the device is using all its powers for rendering the scene. This can be a really big disadvantage for multitaskers, unless you have a really strong GPU and loads of memory. The last downside of PBR materials is that once they are tiled, they create repetition that looks very unnatural. Although the textures are often seamless and blend together, This repetition is usually very noticeable, which makes the object look artificial. Generally speaking, this is a challenge with any image texture, but there are methods on how you can get rid of this repetition, such as adding randomness to the tile rotation, color variation, or mixing two or more materials together. This can be done with third-party extensions, such as the anti-tile add-on, or as a free alternative, I recommend checking out Andrew Price, who made a whole video about this topic. In the video description, he appended this Blender file with a node group that can do the same thing, so you can use it in your own projects. Now let's talk about procedural materials and how they differ from PBR materials. Unlike image textures, procedural materials are entirely made with nodes. The materials are being created directly in the shader editor, which makes the work with them very flexible. Basically, it's a non-destructive way to create materials, because every value or parameter is easily adjustable with nodes. This is a huge advantage because this way you can easily adjust or animate any property. This also means that you can create unlimited variations of the same texture or make the material animated. And because procedural materials can be 3D or even 4D and have no boundaries, we can apply them to any 3D model without marking seams or unwrapping the mesh. The material will adapt to the shape of the 3D model, so it will match without any visible seams. Another big advantage of procedural materials is that they are resolution independent. Unlike raster textures, which have limited resolution, procedural materials are generated using mathematical algorithms and vectors. This means that the entire material is defined mathematically rather than being limited by pixel resolution. Since patterns and shapes in procedural materials are defined by math, they can maintain sharpness and detail regardless of the scale or camera distance from the object. This makes procedural materials ideal for achieving high-quality results, even in close-up renderings, without worrying about pixelation or loss of detail. The level of detail is something that can be adjusted in the texture nodes, which is a plus if the material needs to be optimized for different renderings. This next advantage of procedural materials makes them suitable even for those with crappy computers, because procedural materials are more efficient than regular image textures. Because they are defined mathematically, they need less RAM memory. On the other hand, image textures are larger in file size, so they need more memory. This also depends on the image format, but formats like PNG, TIFF, or OpenEXR usually contain more layers, channels, and metadata, since they offer lossless compression, which makes the file size bigger. So if you load an 8K texture just to have more detail in your render, but you don't have enough memory to process it, the performance will go drastically down, and your computer might freeze or completely crash as well. Procedural materials don't have this problem. They do not care about unnecessary data, and if the material is not too complex, the adjustments and procedural editing are done in real time. The last advantage is not related to performance or technical limitations, but I think it is probably the most important one. Because procedural materials are not captured but procedurally made, this way you can learn how to use nodes to create a certain texture or pattern from reference, and how to recognize and add different layers to the material to make it look more natural and realistic. But despite all these advantages, even procedural materials have their downsides, so let's get through them. The first one is that the creation process is much more complex. Creating a high quality and detailed procedural material from scratch requires a deeper understanding of the material structure, mathematics algorithms, and parameters, as well as knowledge of nodes and their purpose. If the materials are too complex, the node group becomes more complex as well, and if you don't know how to manage them, you can get lost pretty easily. Also, since you are not capturing but creating the material from scratch, it obviously takes more time and effort to combine the nodes in a way that the material matches the real reference. The next disadvantage is that these materials are not always suitable for realistic renders. The reason is that even with great attention to details, with this method, it is very complicated to mimic all imperfections and details of the real material as PBR materials do. From the visual side, procedural materials are often more simplified than PBR materials because everything is defined by vectors. Now, I am pretty sure that there are a lot of realistic procedural materials, but generally speaking, they are just suited for different purposes. It is definitely possible to create realistic looking material just with nodes, but it would be so time consuming that it would be more efficient to use image textures. And the last disadvantage is that these types of materials are usually compatible only with the program where they were created. PBR materials have a huge advantage on this one, because image textures are a universal way to create materials in 3D, and they are supported with almost all 3D programs. However, when it comes to procedural materials, all 3D programs have their own node system, meaning you cannot just export the node group and import it into another program, because it won't be able to read it. So if you make procedural material in a Blender, you can procedurally adjust the material only by using the Blender. The only way to use the material in different programs is by baking it into an image texture and exporting it, but then you won't be able to adjust it anymore. So if I had to summarize these, both shading methods are very useful, but they just serve different purposes. So which one of them is better? Well, if you are doing architectural visualizations, product design, short movies, and renderings where realism is a priority even in close-up renders, and you have enough memory, then PBR materials are a better option. However, if you are focusing more on motion design, stylized renders, cartoons, or minimalistic designs, and you would like to create more variations of one texture, then procedural materials are a better option for you. I hope you took some value, and if you did, subscribe to Graphinity and like this video. And if you are interested in 3D, you should also check out my other videos, where you can find out how to get free access to unlimited 3D models and textures. With that being said, that is all from my side, and I will see you next time. Bye.